I want you to imagine an artery. It's not carrying blood, but it's carrying the lifeblood of our modern world. Boxes, barrels, and massive cargo ships. This artery is very real. It's dangerously narrow, and it's way more important than you probably realize. Just let that sink in for a second. At its skinniest point, a single channel of water, not much wider than a long airport runway, is carrying 1/4 of everything humanity buys and sells. This is the Strait of Malacca. So, how did this one specific place become so critical to, well, everything? The answer isn't complicated. It starts with a simple, unchangeable fact: geography. Yeah, before we even get to the economics, we have to look at the map. The power of this strait is a direct result of pure geography. It's really pretty straightforward. If you want to ship something by sea between, say, the Middle East and the massive factories of East Asia, you have to navigate the islands of Southeast Asia. And the Strait of Malacca? It is, by a huge margin, the shortest, most direct path. You know, geography didn't just create an option here, it basically created an inevitability. And listen, this is not some new revelation. For more than 1,000 years, whoever held power over this strait essentially held the keys to the kingdom. You had ancient empires taxing spice traders, and European colonial powers battling for control. All the modern era did was pour gasoline on the fire and multiply that importance 1,000 times over. And that brings us to this really key idea, the maritime choke point. It's just what it sounds like, a place where geography forces an immense amount of sea traffic into a tight, vulnerable squeeze. In shipping, time is money, and these choke points are the ultimate shortcuts. Now, the world has a few of these critical spots. I'm sure you've heard of the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, right? But what makes the Strait of Malacca arguably the most critical of them all is the unbelievable, staggering volume of what flows through it, and just who depends on that flow. So let's get into those numbers, because it's one thing to say the strait is busy, but it's another thing entirely to really get your head around the scale of it all. The numbers are just wild. Okay, picture this. Every single day, around 300 ships pass through this channel. During the day, that's a new ship entering the strait roughly every 5 minutes. And a huge percentage of that traffic is energy. We're talking 16 million barrels of oil every single day. That's the fuel for entire continents. So when you add it all up, the oil, the gas, the finished goods, the raw materials, it accounts for a full 25% of all seaborne trade on the entire planet. 1/4. It's just incredible. Now, what's really crucial here is who is on the receiving end of all this. For the industrial powerhouses of East Asia, this strait isn't a nice to have. It is their absolute non-negotiable lifeline. There's no other realistic route for the energy they need. And this really paints the picture. For countries like Japan and South Korea, almost all of their imported oil has to sail through this one strait. And China, which is now the world's biggest oil importer, sees this as the main highway for its energy supply. You take this away, and their economies could grind to a halt. But remember, it's not just about energy flowing in. Think about what's flowing out. The smartphone you're holding, the computer on your desk, your car. There's a really good chance their journey from a factory to you started right here. The tiny little semiconductors from Taiwan, the complex electronics from Japan, all those manufactured goods from China, they all get onto this one giant conveyor belt to the rest of the world. A disruption here isn't just a headline, it's a delay or a price hike on stuff we use every single day. And the conductor of this whole incredible orchestra? That's Singapore. It's sitting in the perfect spot right at the southern gateway, and it's become one of the world's most efficient ports. It's basically the central nervous system that allows this unbelievably complex system to work. So we have this system of unimaginable importance, but its greatest strength, this incredible concentration of trade, is also its biggest weakness. The whole thing is inherently fragile. So what are we talking about when we say risks? Well, first, just sheer congestion. It's so crowded that collisions are a constant threat. Then there's piracy. It's been suppressed, but it's always a shadow lurking in these waters. The environment itself is a challenge too. The strait is surprisingly shallow in many places, meaning there's a real risk of ships running aground. And finally, you have the weather. Monsoons and thick fog can pop up and just add another layer of danger to an already risky situation. We all remember when the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal, right? That was for just 6 days. The price tag was insane. Almost $10 billion a day in lost trade, backing up supply chains for everything. Okay, now get this. The Strait of Malacca handles even more volume than the Suez. A blockage here, whether by accident or on purpose, would send a shockwave through the global economy that would make the Suez incident look like a walk in the park. Our entire global economy is essentially built on the quiet assumption that this one waterway will always be open. But as we've seen, this artery has its vulnerabilities. It reminds us that our deeply interconnected world is balanced on just a few very fragile geographic points. And that leaves us with a pretty chilling question. What happens if one day the flow stops? This isn't just a stretch of water. In a very real way, this is the circulatory system of our entire global economy. It's a narrow, 900-kilometer channel that, believe it or not, holds the modern world together. So, let's take a closer look at this critical artery and really understand why its pulse basically dictates the health of our whole interconnected civilization. And that brings us to a pretty terrifying question, one that strategists and economists lose sleep over. What if this one passage were to close? Because if that happened, the shockwaves would be felt in every single corner of the globe. The stakes really couldn't be any higher. I mean, think about it. Every single day, a literal river of steel flows through the Straits of Malacca. We're talking super tankers loaded with oil from the Middle East, massive container ships packed with all our electronics and clothes from Asia, and vessels carrying the raw materials that fuel industry everywhere. It is the main highway between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Okay, but here's the crucial point. This absolutely vital lifeline, it's also a point of extreme vulnerability, and its importance has given rise to this profound strategic anxiety, a problem that has its own name, the Malacca Dilemma. So where did this term even come from? Well, it popped up in the early 2000s. Chinese strategists were looking at a map and saw a simple but really unsettling reality. Their entire economic security depended on a waterway that was completely outside of their control. Any disruption, whether it was from a conflict or even just piracy, could put their whole economy in serious jeopardy. And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. It comes down to hard arithmetic. Roughly 75% of China's imported oil has to travel through the Strait of Malacca. When your national security is that tied to your energy security, a number like that, well, it becomes a focal point for your entire foreign policy. But let's be really clear here. This is not just China's problem. This chart makes that pretty obvious. The anxiety is shared all across East Asia. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, all of their advanced economies are powered by energy that flows through this exact same choke point. They all share the same fundamental vulnerability. So how do you deal with a vulnerability that massive? Well, you don't just sit back and accept it, you try to build redundancies. First off, you build pipelines, like the China-Myanmar route, to try and bypass the strait altogether. Second, you stockpile huge strategic petroleum reserves to buy yourself some time if there's a crisis. And third, you project power. You build up a navy to protect your interests out on the water. And that, of course, leads to this. Wherever commerce flows, navies are sure to follow. The waters in and around the strait have become a very crowded neighborhood. You've got the US Navy there ensuring freedom of navigation. You've got China's rapidly expanding Navy there to protect its economic lifelines, and you've got the Indian Navy, which is increasingly active, seeing the region as critical to its own security. Now, this isn't about some imminent battle, but it definitely raises the risk of a miscalculation. But for all the attention we pay to the global powers, the day-to-day stability of the strait really rests in the hands of the nations that actually border it. And that brings us to the guardians of the strait. Each of these nations plays a distinct but totally interconnected role. You have Indonesia, this massive archipelago, acting as the coastal guardian, patrolling its huge territory while carefully maintaining its neutrality. Then there's Malaysia, anchoring the eastern side, focused on commerce and fighting piracy. And of course Singapore, right at the strait's southern exit, which has turned itself into the region's indispensable strategic and logistics hub. Their cooperation isn't just a nice to have, it's the absolute bedrock of the strait's security. And you know what? All that cooperation has had some incredible, tangible results. After the Malacca Straits Patrol was launched back in 2004, piracy incidents, which used to be a huge threat to global shipping, just plummeted. It's really a testament to the fact that sustained, cooperative security is possible, but it takes constant effort and a whole lot of trust. But that very success brings us right back to that central, unsettling question. What if, despite all these efforts, the straits were to somehow become impassable? Let's walk through the immediate, cascading consequences of that kind of nightmare scenario. Okay, the first impact wouldn't even be physical, it would be psychological, and it would be immediate. Markets would absolutely panic. Oil prices would spike on fear alone. Then the real crisis begins. Ships are forced to reroute, creating total logistical chaos. This chaos then triggers the collapse of these fragile just-in-time supply chains. And the final step, a severe global economic shock, impacting everything from factory output to the price of milk at your local store. So you're probably wondering, can't ships just go around? Well, yeah, they can, but at a punishing cost. The alternatives, like the Lombok or Sunda Straits, add thousands of kilometers and days of travel time. And that's not just an inconvenience. We're talking about a massive increase in fuel costs and a fundamental disruption to the tightly scheduled logistics that our entire global economy is built on. And this really shows us exactly which sectors would get hit the hardest. Basically, any industry that's built on a just-in-time model is exquisitely vulnerable. Think about a car factory in Europe waiting on a part from Taiwan, or an electronics company waiting for a component from Southeast Asia. A delay of just a few days can literally shut down an entire assembly line. This kind of extreme vulnerability has pretty naturally fueled a search for solutions, a search that's been going on for over a century. So now we come to the search for an alternative. The goal here is to design resilience into the system, to try and mitigate this huge single point of failure before a crisis forces our hand. Now, the most ambitious idea by far is the Crack Canal. The proposal is to just cut a massive channel right across Thailand, bypassing the Strait of Malacca completely. It sounds like a great idea, but the reality is just daunting. The cost is astronomical, the environmental impact would be huge, and honestly, the geopolitical fallout of rerouting global trade like that is completely unpredictable. So for now, it remains a dream on paper. So if the giant canal is a no-go for now, what's the actual game plan? Well, the more practical path forward is really a multi-layered approach to building resilience. This means diversifying energy away from seaborne oil and towards things like pipelines, LNG, and renewables. It means companies investing in redundant logistics and keeping more stuff in stock. And most importantly, it means deepening that regional cooperation that has kept the Strait safe and open for so long. In the end, the Strait of Malacca is just this incredibly powerful reminder. In our digital age of instant everything, the physical world, the narrow channels, the deep water, it still fundamentally shapes our civilization. The question isn't just about whether we can survive its disruption, it's about whether a globalized world, a world built on the promise of pure efficiency, has maybe become a system that's just too fragile to handle the unyielding realities of geography.